So I don't really know exactly what this video is and exactly how it's going to go, but it's something that I've been interested in trying for a while, and this seems like a good time to give this a go. So I'm working on sort of the next complication that I'm going to add to Watchsmith, which is this app I just launched that is all about sort of giving you a variety of different and customizable complications for your Apple Watch. That's like what its core function is. And so as you can see, it has a wide variety of these in it. And I'm always looking to add more. And the one I wanted to add today that I thought would be interesting to kind of record the process that I go through to do this and kind of narrate it is a new Tide complication that I'm going to be adding. It's probably worth saying at the beginning, though, this is not really intended to be a coding tutorial, like exactly like teaching you how to do this. It's more just hopefully giving you a sense of what this goes into this, some of the design considerations, and that there's something to learn from that experience. But we'll see. It's the first time I'm doing this. I have no idea. So the Tide complications that exist currently in Watchsmith, there's two of them. One of them is sort of the tide height graph, as you can see here. It graphs out the tide height as well as showing the high and low tide on it. And there's another one that's kind of in the shape of a disk. And both of these have a 24-hour bezel to them. So the midnight is up here, noon is at the bottom, and then sort of you see your progress through that with the hand here. And in many ways, this is based on sort of a classic watch called the Abercrombie & Fitch Seafarer, which amusingly, like this is Abercrombie & Fitch before they were like the modern Abercrombie & Fitch, which is like more of like a teen, early 20s clothing store. Like this is back then this was like a hunting store that had like this watch was actually intended for sort of like outdoorsmen, which it would show the tides here. And they had a sort of a dial that rotated around. Rather than every 24 hours, it would rotate every 24 hours and 50 minutes. And that's because a particular sort of tide point in most places in the world kind of oscillates on about a 24-hour and 50-minute cycle. This dial on the Seafarer would rotate by that amount, and then so you could kind of see where high and low tide were as a result. And I kind of like the aesthetic of this, and that's why I made the tide disk follow that. But I've gotten a bunch of feedback from people who use tides, that especially from people, it seems like in the fishing community, like people who, not necessarily like commercial fishing, but people who like want to go out fishing or boating, that a much more common shape for a tide sort of display is not that kind of 24-hour version. It's much more sort of temporal based. And so it has this kind of a look. And this is called a tide clock, as best I can tell. And so what you see here is you have at the top is always the next high tide, and at the bottom is always the next low tide. So it gives you a sense kind of temporally of where you are, and so that this hand points to how long until the next tide it is. So you kind of, it has 5, 4, 2, 1, sort of roughly this is the halfway point. Obviously this is kind of one of the funny things about this is there aren't exactly 6 hours in between tides. And so, this is sort of an estimate in many ways. And what's kind of interesting here, too, is that this will slowly get out of sync over time, because this is a static version of this where there's a fixed amount of time between the two tides. Whereas if I go over to my tide source here, the amount of time kind of between tides is, it sort of averages out to whatever that is. What did I say? It was, so there's 24 hours and 50 minutes. So like 50 divided by 4 is the sort of extra that you'll typically have between tide cycles. But that isn't always the case. I use a weather provider here, World Tides, to power my app that sort of actually gives me the real data. And so what I can do is actually calculate, how much time it is between tides, and sort of use that and kind of back into that accordingly. So that's what I'm going to do, and kind of what I'm going to show is how I'm going to build this. Some kind of funny things that first come off the top of my head. Tide data is always available kind of on a forward-looking basis, or at least I have to assume that it will be available in a forward-looking basis, in the sense that I can't really know reliably when the last tide was. I can only kind of know when the next one is going to be, which could be a little bit tricky. I think what I'm going to have to sort of do there, in the sense of knowing how far back this, so if this was the sort of the situation I found myself in, knowing how far this distance should be, could be a little bit tricky, because I'll know where I am here, and I'll know this amount of time, but I don't necessarily know that amount of time. What I'll probably do is just assume that it is based on the sort of the average, and then extend that if I need to. So if in the current circumstance I'm farther away from whatever that amount of time is from the next tide, I will just adjust accordingly. And there's also a few weird cases that might come up where there's certain places in the world where like you don't get this nice sort of rhythmic tide pattern. That's unfortunate, and at least for this first version, I'm just going to kind of ignore that and build something that will work for most places most of the time. And if you happen to use this in a place that doesn't allow that, or that's not how the tides work there, well, like things are going to be different, and we'll kind of see how that goes. So I'm going to jump over, and you can see I've already done all this setup to create kind of the infrastructure for adding tide clock to the app. I'm not going to show that in this screencast, primarily because it's very specific to Watchsmith. Like I've built this infrastructure where I can sort of define a complication type, and there's a bunch of like infrastructure and background work that I have to do to kind of add it. But then once I've added it, it'll just like appear in the app and kind of dynamically appear on the watch and so on. So I don't need to necessarily get into that. But instead, I'm just going to jump over into Xcode and kind of show you this process. So the first thing I'm going to do is I go over into my I'm going to go into my app delegate, and I'm just going to change my root nav so that instead of pointing to the normal like actual app part of the app, it's going to point to this kind of what I call like my working view controller. And this is just something that I've built into the app that is all it does is show the preview image for a particular complication. So I can say like I want to make the tide clock complication. I can give it a location, and then it just makes a big image. In this case, 200 pixels by 200 pixels, and I can just show that right here. And so this right now it's blank because I haven't started working on it. But I find this is a much more convenient way than having to like dive down into the app as I'm building it. I can just kind of keep quick launching back and forth, and I'll see my progress here. So I'm going to jump back over here, and so this is the handler. So each of my complications gets defined with this handler, and this is just sort of, they follow a protocol that sort of defines all the various things that this particular complication can do. Like, does it support a font? Does it have the various color options? Does it support hands? Can it avoid the hands? And a whole bunch of sort of things like that. So I'm going to go through and adjust these. So this particular one I expect will be able to support a font. It doesn't have a top color. It doesn't have a bottom color. It probably supports a tint color, which would probably be, in the context here, it'll be sort of the color for the text itself. So I will say that it supports a tint color. It supports a background color. It supports hands. I can't really avoid hands because it's always going to be filling this full space. It supports a location because you need to know where it's from. And for now, it won't support any of the other features. Great. So I'm going to come over here, and right now I've just copied the code that I used for my other tide complications, and this does a lot of the bookkeeping that I would need otherwise to take care of. And so here you can kind of see what that looks like. So this is the tide height complication with its 24-hour scale. But I'm just sort of copied this straight over because now this gives me the benefit of now having all of the actual tide data stuff, which I'm not really going to talk about in this, is now available. So I can just like get the information about when the next tide is and so on. But it obviously includes a lot of stuff that I don't need. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through and kind of comment all this out. So I'm going to come back, and so now we should have this blank thing, but it will instead now include, so it's still blank, but now I have access to the next tide information in this kind of tide data source object. Gives me a forecast. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get the next tide, basically. So in my forecast object, I can look in here, and I have a bunch of different data here, and specifically one that I'm interested in here is extremes. So extremes are the high and low tide points in the way this particular data structure is set. But it's an optional because I may or may not have it available. So if I don't have it, so I'm just going to So if I have that data, then I can start actually working with it. So then the first thing I'm going to do is just going to say, if I can get the next one, so now I know what the next tide is. I can kind of get some information about it. And so these tide objects have a couple of actions, and basically the ones I'm interested in is it's the height, and then there's the time that this happens, and the type of the tide. Those are the three things that a particular tide can give me. For right now, I'm just going to grab the time and get a sense of how far away from now that is. And then I need to determine kind of, is this going to be on the bottom or the top? So so if next tide.type, I think it's this, I think. This is probably an area where I should be using some kind of enum or something, but I am fundamentally a lazy developer, and I don't always do that. So nope, it looks like it's high and low. So so this is if the next tide is a low tide. So then this is the time that is going to appear all the way at the bottom of the sort of the complication. And so I need to work out kind of how far away from the current time I am for this. And I was in something to point out. So when the complications are being run, rather than being the current time, so rather than doing like, just getting a new date, I need to actually compare it to the time that's given into my render configuration. And this is just something that the sort of Watchsmith infrastructure does, because I need to potentially be able to generate this into the future. Because obviously I know this data ahead of time, so I can predict what the complication should look like, and then it makes it a much more reliable update for this. So so let me just grab I can do this for either extreme. I can get the kind of the time difference. And so this is going to be next tide.time, time interval since date, and this will be my config.date. So this is the date that is kind of passed in, so for when I'm generating this data for. So now I know sort of how far I am. So in this case, if it's a low tide, then I'm going to be subtracting this from the bottom. And if it's a high tide, I'm going to be subtracting it from the top to kind of work out where I am. So let's see, to do that, so we said it was, how long did we say a particular tide was? It's 5 hours, it's 24 hours, 50 and 50.5 minutes. Great. So let me just define that as sort of a, so that is 24 times 60 plus 50.5. So that's the tide, that's the sort of a day's tide in minutes. And so each particular tide, this is the daily tide length. And so a particular tide length is going to be the daily tide length divided by 4. So that should give me a general amount of how long in minutes I need between things. And because of all these things are actually going to come out in seconds, I'm actually going to turn that into multiply by 60 to get the time in seconds. And so then now I can actually get it. Also, what I can do is I can say radians per second. And this, so for each of these tides, I'm going to be sort of dividing a circle in half. And so each one of those is, let's see, CG float up high. Yeah, so it'll just be half, that is just half of a circle divided by tide length seconds. So that's how many radians. So I need to turn this, all these into CG floats, because it always drives me crazy when Swift gets angry about that. All right, so now I know how many radians per second each tide length is, and I know how long the difference is here. So now I can get the angle, which is going to be, let's see, so the bottom, I think the bottom tide point, this is one of those things that always hurts my head. I think it's pi over 2 will be low tide, and 1.5 pi will be high tide, just in terms of like, because I think it starts at the bottom and or it starts at the like rightmost part of the circle and then like goes around clockwise. Maybe we'll see. I can never remember this, but it doesn't really matter because I can just guess. So I will take that point and then I will subtract the radians per second times the time difference. And I should probably just do the absolute value there because I think that's going to be more reliable. And again, I need to turn this into a CG float because everything. It's one thing I don't like about Swift. All right, so I've got an angle. And so now I'm just going to start with, I'm just going to kind of draw that point on my circle, and we'll kind of see how that goes. So I'm going to take my angle. So let's see. So I'm so let me draw a Bezier path. So let's just draw a circle to start with. And I have a couple of little tricks that aren't really part of this, but will be useful. So I'm just going to grab, I have a little helper function for CGRect where I can give it one of these has an angle in it, center, radius. Oh no, wait. So I'm forgetting the wrong thing. So I need to get the point first, and this is where I have my little helper. So I made a helper here where I can give it a center, and then I can give it an angle and a radius. But I need to work out what my center is first, and so that I'll just define a point, and this is just going to be the size of the image I'm trying to generate divided by 2, and this is a width. So I'll have the center will be sort of a width and a height. So now I know what my center is, and the angle I'll throw whatever one I have in there, and the radius here is going to be, so let's just say it's the size dot width times 0.45, say. So that should be like essentially I should have a circle right along the edge of the thing. And so now I can say I want to make an oval around the CGRect, and now I can do the other thing I had, which was I can give it a center and a radius. And so I'm just going to pass in my point here, and for the radius, I'm just going to say like 5. And then I'm going to set the fill color to white, set fill. And then I'm going to fill my circle, and I'm going to repeat this here, but the angle here is going to be 1.5, and actually I'm going to tell these apart by saying the low tide is going to be orange and the high tide is going to be blue, and let's see what happens. I have no idea if that'll work, but that's sort of the process, and that's kind of the way this goes. So, okay. So I have a orange dot, so it thinks that the next tide is there, which I should probably put a breakpoint and get a sense of if that is at all working correctly or if it's just not. So let's see what it says here. So as my time difference, so I'm 18... So the little tool that I always use when I'm developing is a tool called Solver, which is just like a way of doing calculations, but you do it sort of graphically. So it's something that I find really helpful. So that's 60 divided by 60. So it says I'm 5.24 hours away from the next tide. And if that's the case, this location here, where it was slightly up, does seem about right. So that's a promising situation. So if I come in here, that seems like if this is supposed to be about about 6 hours from here to here, or 6 hours and 20 minutes or whatever, that dot does seem sort of roughly in the right spot. So that's promising. So the first thing I'm going to do though, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to draw the text low here and high here, because that's something I'm going to kind of have to do either way. So to do that, I'm going to first, I'm going to grab the font that I need. And this is one of those things where it's like I have this whole system with font types where I can ask my config for the complication it has and then ask what its font is. I give it a size and a weight. I'll probably do semi-bold here so I have a font. And then I need to draw this. And this is an area that I actually have a big sort of helper function for. And I'm just going to grab down here. I have a little example of this that I prepared or stole from another part of the app that I'm going to reuse here. So the first string I'm going to put is just going to say low. Yeah. And then I need to grab the size of it so I know kind of how far up I need to draw it. And that is just, I'm just using like string.size, and I have a little extension to this that removes the descender because I don't care about that for this particular thing. Like I don't need to make extra space for like a G or a Y that goes underneath. For high, obviously I do, but for low I don't. And so I can kind of push it a little bit closer to the edge probably. And then I'm going to sit him here and I'm going to draw this. And the angle for this, I think, is the CG float pi to pi times 2. And we'll see how that looks. Now, if that all is working, so this curved text thing is just something that I built for all my other, don't need to pause there. Oh, interesting. So it's putting it up here. Wonder if that's, so this one's asking for, wonder if it's because I'm drawing this text system is doing it using a different system than the other way. Yeah. No, I think it is. Well, that's interesting. So it does put low here. I'm not sure if I actually want it to look this way. I might want to reflect that horizontally. But for now, that's fine. To start doing this a little bit more thoughtfully. So I'm just going to strings to draw is going to be an array of just tuples that are going to be a string and an angle. So it's a string and a CG float. And that's going to give me a lot more flexibility. And ultimately, when I need to draw the numbers is probably a good place to be. So if I do this one, it's going to get drawn at CG float dot pi times 1.5. And high is going to get drawn at 0.5, and then I can and for all the elements in the string to draw, I can repeat this process, and that'll be a much more. So now rather than get, now I get the element dot 0 as my string, and as the angle I can do element dot 1. And see, so now I should have low on the bottom and high at the top. If that all worked. Yep, low and high. Like I said, I don't really like the way this looks here, but for now that's fine. I'll deal with that kind of after this. So the next thing I probably need to actually do is I can just go ahead and start drawing the hours that I need as well. So I can start this. So I want to draw sort of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, because I think the 6 would just get crushed. So I just want to draw those elements, and I can add them into this strings to draw array is probably a reasonable place to put them, and then it should just all get drawn for me. So I need to draw 5. So let's just say for I in, it'll be 1 to 5. So now I have those numbers, and now I can just sort of see, I can kind of get their offsets. And so this is going to be CG float I times radians per second, which is the thing I defined previously, so I can know kind of how far I need to go for each of these. And I'm going to start off by doing these for, so for the low tide. So for the low tide, it will be, I need to get the angle, and that's going to be CG float.pi times 1.5. just call this the low angle. It'll be that minus the offset, I think. And the high angle is going to be, let's see, I'm not sure about that. And then I can do strings to draw, dot append, and I'm going to put in the value and the low angle, and then I'll add another one that is the high angle. All right, so now let's see if that draws. So now I should have a whole bunch of numbers all in the same spot. That's not right. So, oh, that's because this is in hours and that is in seconds. So that's what I need. I need to turn this I is the hour, not the not in seconds. Oh, there we go. So that's sort of vaguely promising. But I'm kind of getting confused as to which is which, so I can't really know. So I'm just going to put an H and an L here for a little bit of debugging. And I can come over here now and see if so they're on the wrong sides of where they should be. So so the low should be maybe plus. Maybe is that what? It's like one of them should be. It's still haven't quite worked out exactly what I'm doing with the angle stuff. So let's see. Yep, that's correct now. So now it's 5 and a bit. 4, 3, 2, 1, and then low, and then it's how many hours away I am from each of the others. So that is all looking good. I might make this font a little bit bigger for the size. I feel like the big thing with this complication is going to be those numbers, and so I want to make those numbers big, and I only have 12 of them to display, so I can kind of make them pretty big. Let's go 32, and then I need to adjust that size so that it's kind of relative for wherever I actually use it in practice. But it's not. Why isn't it drawing the right size? Oh, because I'm not actually using the font that I'm passing or creating up there. I'm actually always using the system font, which is not what I want. So let's see if I change that. What do I get? Yep. Okay. So now that's working. Now it seems correct. So let's just, now I can actually make the fonts the appropriate size. And you'll notice that they switched over now to using a different font rather than the system font. Yeah, so that looks good. And I can remove the I and the L. Great. And great. So now this is looking pretty close to what I might want. So I've got the high and the low, and this is, right now I'm at 5 hours away from low tide, and so it's kind of in the right spot for that. So the next thing I'm going to do is use the hand rather than the this dot, because I need to draw a hand. And so if I come back to that code that I had stolen from the other one, what I can do here is, let's see, it's this, I think. And I'll show you what this, what the code is doing in a moment. Let me just grab the stuff that I need. So rather than drawing a, so really what I'm doing here is whatever the next tide is, I'm going to need to draw it as a hand. Whoops, let's indent everything because everything's a mess. Here we go. So let's just start with the hand color of white. And so then this basically is a little function that I've built where I ask for a hand of a particular shape, and I give it a radius, and then I draw it. And all it really needs from me is the angle. So what I'm going to do here is make the define the, rather than drawing each of these individually, I'm just going to grab the angle and set it, whether I'm high or low, and then just change this to be that angle that I just drew. And now let's see if that draws in the right place. It looks like I'm making some adjustments here, so it needs to be in the top right. Yep, so that's looking promising. So now I've got a hand that's pointing to this, and if I change, if I go back into my working config and I change the hand type, so rather than it being that rounded one, say I wanted Delphine hands, then it should grab that correctly from here, because I'm sort of passing in what hand shape I want by grabbing it out of the configuration here. And if you're an eagle-eyed viewer, you'll notice that I'm missing the punch out, so I need to come back here, and there's a little bit of code here that I can steal from my other time that I did this, where I basically, because I need this to work not just when it's not just when I'm drawing in black, I need to also make it transparent. I can set the blend mode to clear and then kind of draw into it. And so I need to know where the center is, and I'll just draw. And the height here, its default is 2, but I think that needs to be adjusted by a scale factor. So let me just say, and that's just going to be the config.size.width divided by, I think it's 47, which is, don't worry about that. The 47 is the size of the infograph large infograph circular type on the 44 millimeter Apple Watch. And so a lot of things I base on sort of drawing for that. And so I'm just going to scale up these. The whole size that I'm punching out is going to be 2.0 times the scale factor. And I'm just going to fix this so that I divide it by 2, and I need to draw, sort of the whole. I'm basically just defining a point that is that that whole size appropriately. And so now if I draw this, or if I run this, I should now have so now I have a hole in the middle here, and all this is doing it so that it scales the size of that appropriately based on where I am. Depending on the hand type, so that should work now if I come, to any of the other types. So if I say I wanted a picket style, it should correctly now still have a hole and be the right size. And it seems like the where it's pointing to seems pretty good. So now it looks like we're almost exactly 5 hours away. So if I come over here and just sort of breakpoint on this time difference, I just want to double check that the time difference should now be almost exactly 5 hours away. So I'm getting a time difference of whatever that is. And if I come back into Solver and put that in here, yep. So now I'm almost exactly, now I'm like 4.99 hours. So the logic seems to be working correctly. So if I run this, now I have the high tide here, the number of hours until the next low tide, and then it should continue and it's been marching along, as you can kind of see, going forward. So the next thing I want to do is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to change my my preview so that rather than it being based on the current time, I want it to be based on the a time in the future. So I need to come in here and specify the date. That should work. Now I should be able to jump forward in time and be able to see that I'm now jumped 2 hours ahead. Great. And so if I go 6 hours ahead is where it gets interesting, because now I should cross the boundary and switch from being based on the high tide to the low tide, or from the low tide to the high tide. Up, yep, and that worked correctly. So now it is making the adjustment based on, let's see, jump back over to the handler. So now it should be basing it on this code here. So now if I run from this breakpoint, the angle, it should not be the low, it's going to be the high. And so this is the time difference from the next high tide, which is, yep, almost exactly. It should be almost just over 5 hours. So this is almost exactly longer than that. And then, so now the only other thing that I need to do is potentially adjust it so that in the circumstance where my time remaining is longer than the average, I just need to make sure it still renders correctly. Like it doesn't like put it over, like right now, the way this is built is that it would slide past the previous low, which is obviously not what I want. I want it to kind of just readjust the scale, which means that what I probably actually need to do is grab this stuff here and move it to after I actually do my calculations for the next tides, so that I can have a more accurate radians per second. And so I'm just gonna make this a var. So I'm gonna start off just like I did before, but if the time difference here is larger than my radians per second value, or actually I guess it's this one, and I need to adjust both of these. So if the time difference is greater than what I've said the time difference is, then I need to make the tide length in seconds equal to my time difference, and then readjust my that, so that it just is sort of a check just in case. I'm just adding little comments so my future self doesn't get confused. Check to see if the current tide is longer than a standard tide, and adjust accordingly. So this is just so now if I ever am in a situation where the current tide is longer than a standard tide, then I won't sort of all fall apart, which seems promising. But otherwise, all the rest of the logic should work fine. And because all of this is just based on that radians per second, everything should kind of just shift to be where it should. All right, so then I don't need any of this here. All this sort of example code that I used as my basis, I don't need any of that. And so now I'm going to go ahead and go back to my app delegate and change this to be the actual app. And now if I come in here and go down to tides, we're promising, right? So it's sort of the obvious problem is that I'm not adjusting the sizes of my text correctly, which I remember saying that I needed to do, but then never actually did. So I just set it to here. So in the same way, I need to grab out the scale factor and multiply my value by that. And so I'm going to do this times the scale factor. I'm going to make it a little bit smaller, and then now adjust, sort of optimizing for the case when it's 47 pixels big, which should hopefully work. So that's still a bit too big. So let's go to 8 maybe. But I'm getting sort of roughly closer into the right place. Let's see here. Very close, but just a little bit too much still, so maybe we'll go to 7. And I may actually change this to LO and HI just for symmetry reasons. I feel like that's going to give us a lot more space where the things are going to, so I'm just going to change this to LO and HI because when we're making it this small, I just really don't think I have space for HIGH. I'm just going to change it to LO and HI, and that should look a lot better. Great. And now in theory, if I change the font, it should change. Yep. So if you can see here, it's changed. If I change the font, it'll readjust it. If I change the tint color, nothing's happening with the tint color. So that is the next thing I'll need to do, and the background color is changing correctly, which is great. And the hand type is changing correctly. So that's great. And I'm probably going to leave it here. The other kind of things, a few things I need to do aren't quite as interesting in terms of getting this ready to ship. But hopefully that was useful and interesting walkthrough of how I add a type. And you can kind of get a sense of what I'm building and kind of how I do that.